It's true. I don't mention that part as much. I do mention the NATO enlargement issue. That people should recall that NATO was established to defend Western Europe against a potential Soviet invasion. Well, there was no potential Soviet invasion at the end of the 1980s, and there wasn't even a Soviet Union after December 1991. And so one could ask, what is NATO still doing there? And I think there were very good arguments for disbanding NATO in favor of this framework of the OSCE that you mentioned, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. But the United States was having none of it. Quite the contrary. And amazingly, as you point out, immediately the United States started to expand NATO rather than dismantle it. So what is the mindset there? The mindset is global hegemony, which is what they announced, and they believed it.
Yeah, and this is one of the puzzles which we should really explore, because keep in mind that from the early 1990s, the main foreign policy of the Russians and the Chinese, for that sake, was to get as close with the US as possible and the West to pursue peaceful cooperation. But in our narrative, we keep saying that, well, we try to reach out to the Chinese and the Russians. However, how can we explain that both the Russian and Chinese leadership have more or less consistently argued since the 1990s that they were still being contained, that we never gave up on the alliance systems and that we kept balancing them. And of course, they reacted in different ways. The Russians were faced with an expanding NATO, so they tended to punch above their own weight. While the Chinese, they didn't experience an expanding military alliance, so they could take their time and build internal strength and try to cooperate with the US and negotiate an end to this containment, but neither side were successful. And what is remarkable in these days, now that obviously we have a war in Europe, you're not allowed to criticize NATO expansion, but it's worth noting that even Bill Clinton himself, as I cite in the book in January of '94, recognized, well, if we do start expand NATO, it could redivide the continent, obviously, and recreate the logic of the Cold War. And this was common sense. This should have been common sense. Indeed, William Perry, the Secretary of Defense under Clinton, he said the same thing. He considered quitting over this, and he argued, everyone in the administration agreed, well, of course this is a betrayal of the Russians. We're going to cancel the entire world order, the European common European home or inclusive system, and instead revive the Cold War. So, and as he said, everyone in the administration recognized that, of course, this was a betrayal, but according to Perry, who cares, they said. Russia's weak, they're getting weaker. We don't have to take into consideration their security anymore. So all the things we now denounce as Russian propaganda, it's already been confirmed by all of our leaders consistently. It's overwhelming evidence, but we are still not allowed to actually cite their actual words. So it's quite an absurd situation.
Why do you think, if Clinton expressed this awareness that maybe this is going to recreate the Cold War, they did it anyway?
Well, I think if they can weaken, if Russia is weak, it doesn't really matter if some of the Cold War dynamic reemerges, as Baker argued at the time. James Baker, he warned against recreating another Cold War, and he also argued against this mentality that we should have NATO as an insurance guarantee against future conflicts with Russia. And everyone recognizes, even people like Madeleine Albright, who was very favorable of expanding NATO, argued, well, it might create conflicts with Russia, but at least if we'll have a conflict with Russia, we'll have them surrounded by NATO. And it's fascinating to go through the Senate debates, because these are all in the archives now. It's all accessible. And when they debated expanding NATO in the 90s, the phrase security guarantee. Insurance. What is it?
Security insurance.
Security insurance. Yeah. This word comes up over and over again, and indeed, it's not that bad if the Russians lash out a little bit, because if they do lash out, then it will only convince the Europeans to further accept American leadership in case we'll have problems with the Russians in the future. So all of this was so obvious and so predictable. Indeed, the American architect for the containment policies, George Kennan, he even outlined it all in an interview in '98, where he said, well, of course, this is going to start a new Cold War, and predicting once the new Cold War begin, we're going to blame the Russians for their imperialist nature. And he said, this is all nonsense. This makes no sense. Even, Jack Matlock, which I also spoke to many times, he argues the same thing. Of course, we betrayed the Russians. We negotiated an end to Cold War. We're going to have a common peace, and we betrayed it. So it's quite, the historical revisionism is just shocking. So, and it's so weird because all the evidence is there, which is why
Yes.
the book is very heavily cited. But it appears in debates these days. No one really cares anymore about the facts. We're so committed to the narrative that we're willing to reject facts, even though they're not disputed. It's, again, quite extraordinary.
So essentially, 1991, the Soviet Union ends, and the U.S. could pursue a policy of indivisible security, a common European home, but it decides to pursue a policy of global hegemony. And that involves expanding its military reach, expanding NATO, essentially dismissing Russia's security interests entirely. As you say, the American view was based on the attitude, well, if Russia objects, what can they do? They're so weak anyway. And my experience, looking back, because I wasn't aware of it at the time, China played very little role that I know of